Welcome back to Off Ball Takes. This is your host, Yarby Laws, and this is my co-host.
For Wells.
We appreciate all the support and the recent content. We have a lot of news to cover around the NBA. You know, some guys being out for the remainder of the season and some notable returns. And before we kick it off, please don't forget to like and subscribe and follow us on Instagram and TikTok at the OBT Podcast for more content and updates.
Yeah, so no comments, on our videos to read today, so we'll just get right into it.
Yeah.
So first one, is a return, right? So that was Joel Embiid, right? So he returned, for the first time since January against OKC, right?
Yeah.
And I guess, shout out to Embiid because I think that he actually looked really good in the game. He looked comfortable. He's basically doing he normally does, right? He's able to score, in a lot of different spots on the floor. Got to the free throw line 12 times, 12 of 12. Had 7 assists, right? Obviously, I guess the main difference in terms of comfort is like, the rebounding is a little bit lower, but obviously it's like, there's nothing wrong with that because he just came back. They were actually down for most of this game. But they ended up, this was OKC without Shea or Jalen Williams, and they ended up coming back. And they ended up, kind of just eking it out, right? 109, 105, right? OKC had a couple of wide open chances to, I guess, kind of take the lead right at the end, but they missed. Their late game offense was a lot different, is going to be a lot different without Shea and Jalen Williams out there. And, they've lost their last few games with both of those guys out. But, Embiid coming back and, looking like, what he's been able to do, that's kind of huge for Philly, right? Because obviously it makes Philly, a much more dangerous team. It makes the players around him, significantly better. Because they have a guy that they can rely on, for, consistent offense, right? He's a guy that averages over 30 a game when he's healthy, in a variety of different ways. He can protect the rim. He's, got a lot of size. I mean, he's their best player, right? So when you have your best player, you're a lot more likely to win games, especially if you have talent around them. And I think it's clear that like there are some solid players around, Embiid on this Sixers team. Obviously Tyrese Maxey, right? Oubre, other role guys like Batum, Lowry has been fine for them. Buddy Hield. Obviously there's guys that are out, right? Like Tobias Harris, he recently got hurt. Like the Anthony Melton, Covington, those guys have been out forever. So they do have a lot of pieces. And I think there's kind of an interesting world where, like, if they manage to kind of, hang around, which they're not going to fall past 8. So, I mean, they're pretty much, more than likely going to be in the play-in unless they, kind of close out these last few games, which they have a better chance to do because Embiid is back. They're currently in a dogfight with the Heat right now, so we'll, update that as that goes on. But, assuming, that they manage to be okay, right, they'll be in the play-in and they might have the scenario where they end up playing, assuming they get out of the play-in, either the Bucks or the Celtics in the first round. And if you're, one of those two teams, that's not the most ideal situation to be in, right? Because ideally, you would think if you're the 1 or 2 seed, you're going to get, especially in the East, right, a relatively milquetoast first round matchup. But obviously, it may not be the case, especially with Embiid looking relatively healthy, because they were one of the better teams in the East, right? They were a top 4 seed basically for the most part, right before he went down. Um, so now we'll see what happens with those two teams. I mean, it's not that they can't beat Philly. It's just that's a much harder first round matchup than it would have been, if he was still, kind of banged up. So it's good to see that he's back.
Yeah, I mean it's kind of wild, the turnaround. I heard that they're investigating some stuff about his return and whatnot, because I think it was like he didn't get treatment at the arena or anything like that, and then he did show up I think like 90 minutes before tip off or something as questionable. So I don't know what was going on there, but that has nothing to do with his performance. I think he left it all out there on the floor for sure. You could tell he isn't quite back to full health, but he still looked very, very good. And even like I guess partial Embiid is a pretty dang good player, and I think that he kind of showed us that as well. And also shout out to him for, I think, inking a deal with Skechers, which is pretty cool. So, he signed a multi-year deal for that as well. So a big day for him. But yeah, I think, with him returning, it does put Philly in an interesting spot because I think they can kind of be like the Trojan horse of the East where, if Embiid, slowly gets better and better throughout the remainder of the regular season, because there's like 5 games left for them. And then, come play in time because, we know they're probably going to be in the play-in. But there is a world where, they could potentially win out, I guess, and hope that Indiana and Miami lose out. And then they, can skirt past the play-in and be a 6 seed. But I think people are going to have to respect Philly a lot more if Embiid is back and playing at a high level. And I think, that is a scary thing, especially if they're a lower seed. That could kind of cause some problems for some top seeds, or like I said, even like if they are in the play-in, they'll probably just breeze through that. But yeah, good to see him back because I know a lot of people were kind of, I guess, not buying the hype. Like people thought he wasn't even going to come back. They might just call the season a scratch, but he showed up and showed out. So like you said, shout out to him.
Yeah. They are, if we look in terms of the games back, right, they're a game and a half behind Indiana and Miami. Now again, like they may pull out, they're up by 1 point against the Heat, with 3.5 to go. But regardless, if you look at their remaining games, right, it's after Miami, it's Memphis, San Antonio, Detroit, Orlando, Brooklyn. So you can pretty much like win probably all of those games. Maybe you lose to Orlando, or like maybe Embiid sits one of those games or whatever. But like, I mean, you pretty much are guaranteed or pretty much a lock to win like pretty much all of those games.
Agreed.
And so if it goes down the wire, right, and the other teams kind of sell, right, because that's a pretty easy schedule, right, to finish things out. So if either Miami or Indiana kind of just manage to find a way to screw things up, then that can make all the difference, right? Because if you look at, like, say the Heat's remaining schedule, they play the Pacers again. So, like, that could be a game that has some huge implications on the standings. And then even after that, right, they play Atlanta. They also play Dallas, but they do play Toronto twice. So their schedule is a little bit more difficult than, Philly's, obviously, because they have to play Dallas and they have to play Indiana.
Yeah.
And then, like if you look at the Pacers schedule, right, it's kind of a similar-ish thing, right? Again, they play the Raptors, and then they also play the Hawks, and they also play the Cavs. So their schedules are more difficult than Philly's, and so Philly has a chance to kind of flip it. I don't remember what the tiebreakers are, but obviously if they just outright win these games, and then they may not matter necessarily. So if they can, and then obviously if you're Boston or Milwaukee, if Philly is out of the play-in, then good for you, because then that means you don't have to play them in the first round. So yeah, and they're up 107-102 with a minute and a half to go, so they're probably going to pull that one out. After Miami had a late lead, early in the fourth. So
that's a big deal. It pushes their win streak to 3.
Yeah. And then moving on, to the Knicks, right? This is bad news, right? Julius Randle, his season, according to Woj, is over, right? He tried to come back, he tried to push through the shoulder injury, but apparently, that's not going to be the case. He's going to have to, I think, have surgery on it, to get it fully repaired. So that's a blow for the Knicks, obviously, right? Because, regardless of, what you think of Randall, right? When healthy, he's their second best player. And it just makes their run a lot more difficult, because obviously that means you're going to be without him, and you're going to be without him. So there is no coming back from that. And it's just bad news. I mean, I guess, for the Knicks, I think we saw enough that, like, when they were fully healthy, we know it's a good team. Obviously, with Anunoby, he's been out for a while too. I think, according to Chris Haynes, the Knicks think that he'll probably be back for the playoffs. So that suggests that we probably won't see him the rest of the regular season. Obviously, he's had some flare-ups, I think, with his elbow, right? Because he had to have surgery on it. So that's rough. And they've, kind of gone on a slide as of late, right? Where they, kind of started to drop, some games, especially like some ones that they needed to win, right? Like they had, the games, what was it? It was against the Spurs, and I think another team, right? Where those were winnable games and they basically just kind of dropped both of them. and they shouldn't have lost them, right? Like the
Yeah.
Spurs one is rough, right? Like that was the awesome one that we hadn't mentioned, right? Where it was like Brunson had 60 or whatever,
Yeah.
61 or whatever, and Wembanyama had 40. But if you're the Knicks, right, you can't really lose that game, right?
Yeah.
That's rough. Um, I think. Oh, it was let's see. Oh, it was OKC. That was
Yeah.
the one where they were up, and then Shea hit the game winner. That was the
Yeah.
other game.
Because Brunson
Um,
hit a nice shot or a nice layup or something like that, and then all of a sudden Shea just came down and hit the game winner.
yeah, and then they lost to the Heat by double digits.
Yeah.
So there's 5 minutes left. They're playing the Kings, so we'll see if they pull that one out. That could be, a possible big win for them because they've dropped to fifth, right? Because they were third with a chance to move up to two. But now they're in fifth. They're a full game behind Cleveland, and they're half a game behind Orlando. So, obviously, kind of have to find a way to pull it out. But if you look at their remaining games, right, they have 3 games against the Bulls, right? And the Bulls have been, relatively respectable. So it's not necessarily a gimme win. And they play the Nets, who I think they've basically been eliminated from the play-in. So their season is
Yeah, they're
pretty much done. Yeah, and then they played the Bucks and the Celtics. So not the easiest schedule in the world. So you're gonna have to potentially win out, some tough games. But for the Knicks, anyways, it's tough because you're not going to be able to make a deep playoff run. I think without at least one of Randall or OG. I mean,
Mhm.
obviously, like we know Randall's gone, but just because they say OG might be back for the start of the playoffs, who knows? We don't know at this point. So, but either way, the run their ceiling is capped now because of those injuries, which is rough because again, they looked really good, right? At from the time they made the OG trade, they were trending upwards, and then the injuries just came, right? Randall's was kind of a freak accident, right? I think it was Jaquez who took a charge on him, and stuff happens, and
Yeah.
unfortunately, that's really bad luck for the Knicks. The good news is that you still do those trades regardless because the goal isn't necessarily to win this year, right? Like you put together a really good team, and now at the very least you have a good foundation going into next year. Obviously, you'll have to decide what you're going to do with some of those other guys, right? Like Bogdanovich, right? Burks. I'm assuming they'll bring back and pay OG Anunoby on a good deal. So, but yeah, that's a tough loss for the Knicks.
Yeah, and it's been like a 2-month build up to all this,
Yeah,
to finding out, if he was ever going to come back. But now that he's going to undergo the season-ending shoulder surgery and whatnot, yeah, it's really disappointing. Like you were saying, they were trending upward in a really nice way because they were 12-2 when Randall and OG were in the lineup together, and they were one of the best defenses, if not the best, in those 14 games. So you do really feel like they are capped out, like you said, and it's going to be a long road to recovery for him. And that's the tough part because I think it'll probably, if I'm doing the math correctly, he'll probably be back by the start of the regular season or around that time. So, he's going to be gone the entire postseason, which is tough. But I think, if OG does come back, I think you feel a little bit better because I'm not trying to hate or anything like that. But we have seen, Randall his game kind of shrinks, I guess, in the playoffs. So I think, Knicks fans, I've seen this online a lot. A lot of people have been, siding with the fact that they think, you don't necessarily need Randall to advance, which is kind of, I guess, a hot take in my opinion. I think, you kind of do because I think, his numbers, they do provide some sort of positive impact. He might have a stinker.
As long as he's on the roster, you need him.
Exactly.
In order to do good.
Yeah, but I
Like
think
to go, to reach your ceiling.
exactly. But I think, you probably would need OG Anunoby a little bit more, just like system wise and what he brings on the defensive end. And I think he's a little bit more consistent than Randall. But regardless, it's kind of like I don't know. It's tough to talk about because they're a relevant team, but it's really hard to talk about OG Anunoby when we don't really know the timetable on him, and then Randall going down for the entire remainder of the season. So it's kind of just L on L with the uncertainty as well. But like they said, I think it was Josh Hart. He was like, tough blow for us, but we got to focus on what we have in the locker room. And Julius Randle will be there to support them, and I think that's kind of the epitome of their season. And looking at them, they are fifth in the East. That's pretty good, considering the season that they've had post All-Star break and post acquisitions. They haven't really worked out the way that they wanted, but when they were playing, they were very good. It's just a matter of can they really push to get a higher seed potentially. I don't know if they would really want that though, but they are on a 3-game losing streak, so they are playing with fire. I think because I think if they lose out, it wouldn't be a good look for them.
Right. Yeah, and that's the tough part because it's just like, again, they made some really good moves, but unfortunately, it's not necessarily that the moves hadn't completely worked out, but you add the injuries onto it, right? Because it's like OG when he played, like you said, they were 12-2 with Anunoby and Randall in the lineup, but the problem is that 12-2, right? And that move was made, at the end of last year, right? That was made in like late December,
Yeah,
and we're in April now, so I mean, you're talking about 14 games in 4 months basically, and that's because those guys have been out for so long. And we know, again, we already know that Randall is not coming back. At least as far as this season goes. So that's tough
yeah,
because the East, again, like the East standings are still kind of in play, right? Because
for sure.
there's only Boston has clinched, where they want to be, right? Everyone else, it's still kind of up for grabs, even like with the Bucks, right? Like obviously they are a game and a half ahead of everyone else, but they've been 500 in the last 10 games, so
They
it's like it's not
literally
like
just
they
lost to the Wizards 2 days
yeah,
ago,
and the
and the
Grizzlies.
Grizzlies. I mean, come on, bro.
Yeah, so um, moving on right to some more players, right? So Kawhi Leonard, right? This one kind of I feel like just came out of nowhere, right? Because the
Yeah,
Clippers, they had kind of normalized it seemed like right after a few games. Because Kawhi was playing pretty well. He was closing some of those games, with Paul George, right? Because they played Philly and that was down to the wire. Kawhi, took him home. Same with Orlando. But then all of a sudden, he got hurt, right? And he's missed the last couple of games, already. And according to Ty Lue, right, he's going to be out at least a couple more, which is not great, right? Because, obviously, they had the win, over the Hornets. And then, of course, like I said, then Kawhi, missed the last game against the Kings and they got smashed. They're about to play the Nuggets, right? And then they play the Jazz. And then after that, they play the Cavs. Then they play the Suns on a back to back, and then the Jazz and the Rockets. So not like a crazy difficult schedule, but there are some good teams in there, and you still have to factor in, right, that after the top three, right, the standings are a little bit tight. Now the Clippers are in this kind of weird spot where they're sort of safe as long as they close out the season like around I guess 500ish or so. What they can't do is they can't go like way below 500, right? I think they're 47-28, so they've played what is that like I guess 75ish games, right? So they basically have like
yeah,
7 games left if you count the Nuggets one that they're about to play. So what they can't do is go like 2-5, right? Or something like that, right? 3-4 wouldn't be great. Um 3-4 is probably the worst you could do because much less than 500, again, they have 2 fewer losses than the Mavs, who are 5. Um, obviously they just got their win against the Hawks, and then they play the Warriors again. But with the Clippers again, you know, it's just kind of interesting because I guess for them, I guess maybe they in a similar way, maybe they feel like their standing is safe, so it might be okay. If Kawhi's like kind of hurt, they'll be okay to sit him out because it's not like every game is tough, but you just have to be careful because if you drop one of those gimme games, then all of a sudden that makes one of the other games a must win. And then instead of being 4, maybe you drop down to 5. I don't think they drop down to 6, because that's 3 games with like 7 games to, that's a 3 game difference with 7 games to go. But obviously you have to keep an eye on it because if it's something that lingers long term, then that pretty much is it for the Clippers season because they're not going to be able to really do much if Kawhi's not healthy, which has been the case with either him or Paul George or both.
yeah.
For their whole time together. So it's just something to keep an eye on. But it doesn't sound like it's necessarily serious yet, but they have already, said like, yeah, he's gonna miss, you know, at least a couple games.
Yeah, it's kind of crazy, like to even think about it, because his health is been very, very good, I think, throughout this entire season. I think he only missed consecutive games once this season, which is like, the complete opposite of like the narrative of his career, where, he's had to battle ACLs, meniscus, like in the same season, which is crazy. But like you said, now he's set to miss the second straight game or whatever and stuff like that. So it's weird. Like you even said, I think, talking about like the questionable tag, like that was really weird as well. And then being ruled out automatically, I think it's intriguing. And I think, they do have, an interesting path forward, I guess, where, you're looking at like the Phoenix Suns. I think it's like they have a short flight or whatever, they have to do the home back to back or whatever with Phoenix. So I guess it would be nice if they were dominant at home, but like they've been pretty bad at home, which is awkward, I guess, considering, that they do have these games, because I think they've lost 5 straight games and trailing by double digits at some point during 10 of their last 12 home games. So that's pretty rough. I know that's not kind of like a random stat, but, since we are talking about the Clippers, that's kind of how we have to get, because they're so random. I think the issue is they're just not locked in at some points, but I think, now you don't want to be unfocused and unhealthy, and I think that's a combination for disaster. I think we've seen it multiple times with this exact core of guys. So, I do hope that, Kawhi does come back sooner than later, but, like you said, they could just be resting him, and saving him for playoffs, but, that could also backfire in their faces, I think.
Yeah, because again, the issue is that if you lose too many games, right, then you drop into that lower spot. Because again, the standings, have already, we've talked about this basically almost every podcast.
Yep.
Now they've changed again, right? Where like we were like, oh, New Orleans is safe. They're probably locked into that 5 spot now, and now they've dropped to 7. So,
Right.
Phoenix was like what 8, I think, a few days ago. And now they're 6. Now
Yeah.
again, when you look at 5 through 8. It's like what? I think Dallas has 30 losses, and then Phoenix, New Orleans, and Sacramento all at 31.
Yes.
Now I
It's
think
tight.
Sacramento. Oh wait, I forgot, because Sacramento, I think they just lost to the Knicks, right? So I guess now they would have 32 losses, right?
Let me check. Yeah, they're gonna have 32 losses in about 30 seconds.
Right, exactly. Yeah, so now they're gonna be, like what, a game or whatever behind New Orleans for 8.
Yeah.
They were already 8, but now it's like gonna be a game as opposed to half a game. So, again, obviously I think the Clippers are probably in a semi-safer spot than those teams, but again,
Sure.
that's why those Suns games are kind of important, because, if both teams kind of win a similar-ish amount, but then like say the Clippers drop both games to the Suns, that's not great, because if that happens, right, then that's 2 wins for the Suns and 2 losses for the Clippers, and then all of a sudden, then you start to get into the danger territory where you might drop a couple of spots. So, but I mean, the main thing is they need to be healthy.
Yeah.
Because they haven't, even when they've had the 3 guys, they just haven't been the same as of late. But I think the hope at the very least is that, as long as Kawhi is healthy, like you can kind of just figure it out. Because as long as he's, a top tier player, right? Then you'll probably at least be fine, or at least in a better spot than what could be. So, but it's
Yeah.
just something to keep an eye on, because again, it just kind of came up out of nowhere. So
Exactly. And like I'm even looking at it, like Phoenix and Dallas, they're right on their tails. And I don't think, because they're going to be chased for the rest of the month. We already know that. So they can't kind of like, take their foot off the gas, which is why it's so awkward. But they're also not good enough to think that they can choose like an opponent that they would rather see, come playoff time. I think like, they're sure there's guys they match up against better, but are you consistent enough to even take the weaker matchup at this point? Who knows?
Yeah, because before, right, it looked like that we were headed for Clippers Pelicans, but now we may possibly be headed for Clippers Mavs again.
Yeah, which could get dark.
Yeah, I mean, the Clippers, to be fair, they did win both of the last 2 matchups, because the Mavs don't really have wing guys that can really stick with Paul George or Kawhi.
Right.
But then you got to factor in, well, the Clippers, even with those guys, don't really have anybody for Luka, and now you add Kyrie to the mix. and things can get really
And
interesting.
playoff environment's going to be completely different than regular season.
Yeah, and then speaking of, again, some other injuries, right? Zion, unfortunately he got hurt
Yeah.
the other day against whatever team they played. I think it
Orlando.
was Orlando. Yeah,
Yep.
Orlando. He hurt his finger or whatever, and yeah, I think he's listed as questionable. X-rays are negative, so that's good. But you know, if he has to miss any time at all, that's pretty dangerous because you're already without Ingram. We
Mm-hmm.
still don't know when he's coming back. So if you're without both of those guys, again, this is kind of the interesting thing, right? Because we talked about it, a while ago, right, when the Ingram injury first happened, and I think you were more on the side of, you know, hey, they could lose some of these games, and if they lose those games, then they're going to drop, and that's
Yeah.
basically what happened. Because again, they were, you know, back and forth 4-5 with the Clippers, and now they're 7. Um,
Yeah.
and they don't have the easiest schedule in the world, remaining. They have some matchups against, some tougher ish opponents, right? Because, like, I know their next game is against the Spurs. So, but again, Wembanyama's been playing well enough that he's been playing about even with a lot of decent teams,
Yeah.
even with their guys being done, right? Because they have guys like Sohan and Vassell where their seasons are over, and he's
Mm-hmm.
playing, at least playing even with these teams, right? Like competing against the Nuggets, competing against Golden State.
Yeah.
And
He's
then you
giving them
look at
problems. Like,
right,
honestly, it wouldn't be surprising if, like, he hands out L's that could
yeah,
potentially screw over everybody in the playoffs, like
right, which
standings
is
wise
nuts.
or whatever.
Yeah, which is nuts.
Mm-hmm.
But like you look around, and like they play the Spurs, then they play the Suns, and like that's a huge game because the Suns have beaten the Pelicans pretty much in the previous matchups, so I
Sure.
believe they have the tiebreaker. And then obviously, like even if you can't get the tiebreaker back, right, you don't want to add an extra loss to your record, and then
Right.
that pushes the Suns forward. Then they play Portland, that should in theory be a win, right? Because Portland's been awful recently. And then after that, they play the Kings, who we'll get to them in a moment. They've lost a couple of guys. Then they play Golden State, who's been playing better. And then they play the Lakers, who've also been playing better. So that's not the easiest schedule in the world. So, the last thing you want is a scenario where Zion all of a sudden has to miss just a couple of games.
Mm-hmm.
Because again, even 2-3 games at this point, I mean, for the Pelicans, they're 45 and 31. So, I mean, they only have basically 5 games, 6 games left. So, I mean, you're at a point now where if you lose, again, 3 of those remaining games, if you go 500, you might drop to like 7, to 8. And then all of a sudden, you go from a guaranteed first round matchup to now you're in the play in. And that's kind of been the concern that we've had with the Pelicans. Same with the Clippers, where it's like, obviously we don't put them in a championship tier, but we know that when those guys are healthy and productive, like that's a good team. But then obviously the problem is that they're not always healthy, and more often than not, they're out. This year they've been pretty healthy, but then right at the wrong time when they're about to peak, then Ingram gets hurt, and then we'll see with Zion. I'm assuming he's not going to miss any real time, but
Yeah.
again, maybe he misses a game or something like that. But either way, that's the last thing you want to have at the end of the season, an injury to both of your stars, that keeps them out because then it's going to be really tough.
Yeah, and it's like you were saying, they're missing Ingram already, and I think he's been out for 7 games, I think. So he's been out for a decent chunk of time, and then Alvarado as well. He's been out for a little bit. I think he's been
Right.
out for like 4 games. So now Zion's in the mix with that. But the game itself was pretty wild in terms of the contact. I thought they were playing hard out there. It looked like playoff kind of officiating, which is intriguing. Hard fouls. And initially, I thought Zion was going to have a more severe injury regarding his leg when he got his legs kind of cut out from underneath him by Gary Harris. I was kind of concerned about that. But then to come to find out it was a finger issue, that's interesting. And they were saying, he tweaked it a little bit. But it is intriguing because I think, like you said, when they're durable, we know that they're amazing. But when they're not durable and when guys are out, they start to lose. They're on a 3-game losing streak. They're in danger of dropping pretty much down to even potentially 9. If the Lakers can ball out, which they've been doing, they've been pretty good as of late. I think they're like 8-2 in their last 10. So, they're kind of climbing. And then the Kings, which we'll get to in a little bit, they've been kind of wishy-washy, I guess, but winning games, but health-wise, not too great. But, the Pelicans could continue to drop if Zion misses time, and I think that's the concern. But like you said, if it's a finger thing, I'm going to guess that he can probably play through it a little bit. He won't be 100%, but, you got to be out there. You can't afford to lose games. I don't want to see the Pelicans drop to number 9, if I'm being honest.
No. Right. Yeah, especially when it's like you were literally 4 or 5 a couple weeks ago.
That's what I'm saying. It's crazy.
And that's how the West is going.
Yeah, it's tight.
Moving up to a couple of the higher seeds, right? Murray's been out for a while. I mean, the Nuggets have still been able to kind of just stabilize stuff, right? Because they have, a relatively easy schedule the rest of the way.
Sure.
I think the Timberwolves, as of right now, are the 1 seed technically because they have the tiebreaker.
Mm-hmm.
OKC has fallen to 3rd, right? Because they lost those games without Shea and Jalen Williams, right? So it's another injury, right? Where those two guys were healthy for the vast majority of the season, and now right at the end they've missed a few games. But and that completely changes stuff, right? Because then if you're OKC and you finish 3rd. Or if you're Minnesota and maybe you finish, 2 or you drop to 3 or whatever, that completely changes who you play, right? For Minnesota, right? They feel like Towns can come back before the end of the regular season. They're 53-23. So, I guess that's like 6-ish games left, right? In their schedule, right? They play the Suns twice, I think, on the front end, the back end of their schedule, right? That's their next game and their last game of the season. They play the Lakers. They also play the Nuggets, which could be a pivotal game in the standings, obviously, depending on what the records are by that point.
Mm-hmm.
And then they also play Washington and Atlanta, right? Two not great teams in there. But that's the thing, And then again with the Nuggets, they have the easiest schedule. Murray's been out, but again they played the Spurs. I know they lost, a couple of games, like what was it like to the Suns and I think Minnesota, but they're still 7-3 in their last 10. And then OKC is the one that's dropped because again they've been without their 2 best players, and that's really tough to overcome. And again in that Sixers game, they had the game and then they just couldn't close it out at the end. That's kind of a devastating loss because ideally I think you'd like to be the 1 seed, even if you're risk playing one of those play-in teams in the first round. It's just you'd rather have home court, I guess, against the Nuggets than not have it. So, again, it's still really close, but obviously, for Minnesota, that's huge because they've been playing really well without Towns, which is good. But we know come playoff time, they're going to need him, especially to just because he's their second best player. So, I mean, you don't want to not have your second best player for the playoffs. So if he can come back before then, that would be nice. We assume Murray will be back. Because nobody's really said that it's like a significant injury. Like it's probably just kind of one of those where it's like we've been winning, and we can just hold them out for as long as we need to. We don't want to risk it. And then OKC, you kind of hope those 2 guys come back relatively soon, so that way, they can kind of do their thing as well.
Yeah, and it's like all 3 of these teams is kind of interesting, how they're all vying for this 1 seed, but now all of a sudden, the injuries are starting to kind of pile up on both squads. And I guess, I'll probably ask this question. Now that we kind of see the teams are a little bit hobbled, which team do you think really needs the 1 seed the most? Because I would probably say it's Minnesota. I think Denver can kind of live without it. I think, they're proving themselves. I think Oklahoma City, since they do have some very severe injuries where you're talking about Shea and Jalen Williams, I think, you don't want to push them too far where, it gets to the point where you're bringing them back before they're 100% or even close to that just for the 1 seed and then for them to kind of flame out in the playoffs. I don't want that to happen. So I would probably say like Minnesota would need the 1 seed the most at this point. Just due to the fact that, like you said, they don't have Towns, and I think the 1 seed could potentially give them an edge over some teams that they normally wouldn't have.
Yeah, I'd say it's probably Minnesota because I just think with OKC, you just can't risk losing both of those guys to try to push for the 1 seed.
Yeah.
So I think that's just obviously they need the 1 seed, I think, ideally too, right? Just as much as Minnesota.
100%.
But it's just, I think, with those 2 guys out, unless it's like, unless it's like, they'll be fine. Like, I just wouldn't risk it because it's just, again, the last thing you want is to have both of those guys, come back too early, like you said, and then have some, and then re-aggravate their injuries, and then you're done.
Yeah.
Your postseason is pretty much toast if those 2 guys, are compromised in any sort of
Yeah,
serious
because
way.
they're the top two
So,
scorers on the team.
right. So for Minnesota, probably them, just because I feel like they're the ones where, like, I mean, all of them have great home records,
Agreed.
anyway, right? And they're all good on the road. I think Minnesota's has the best road record of those three teams.
Yeah.
So I mean, and they actually have the worst home record, of those two teams. But I guess if that's the case, you know, maybe home court advantage won't matter for them as much. But I
Maybe.
mean, but again, when you're in the playoffs, it resets to zero. So I mean,
Yeah.
I'd probably say Minnesota, just because it's like you're waiting for Towns to come back and you've still been playing well without him. So it's like it may just be more likely that they might have a chance to get it. But then it's like, again, the Nuggets have the easiest schedule. So they may not need Jamal Murray to just win out games and get the 1 seed. And then if they get it over Minnesota or OKC, then you're probably not going to have a great chance at beating them anyways, unless Murray's injury is more serious.
Yeah.
So I think the Nuggets definitely needed the least for sure. I'd say Minnesota or OKC, it's probably equal. It's
Mhm.
just I think Minnesota will probably push harder for it because they at least have Edwards
Yeah.
and basically everyone else.
Mm-hmm. That's how I feel
Um,
too.
Yeah, and then back to the other seeds, right? Derek Lively, right? I think Jason Kidd mentioned he's going to be out for potentially a couple of weeks,
Okay.
which is again kind of rough considering, like, he's he's been their backup center since they've acquired Gafford. He's way better than their other backup bigs. And you kind of saw it right when they played Golden State, the other night, right? Obviously, that Dallas has played very well anyways as of late, right? That's like one of their few losses as of late. But it's just against that team, having Gafford and Lively being able to use their size and run up and down and length, able to run up and down the floor, is just more effective than having like Dwight Powell out there or Maxi Kleba. You're without Josh Green as well, right? Again, it's not, the injuries aren't as severe because it's not like Luka or Kyrie is out. It's just something that just kind of, when those other guys are playing, it just makes their rotation better. Because they have a lot of guys where I think after those two players, they're kind of in similar tiers. And then like the ones that are toward the bottom are worse, right? Like, like Maxi Kleba, and Dwight Powell. They're just not guys I think that you want ideally playing like major minutes. Um, so ideally, if you can get Lively back, and Josh Green back by the playoffs or something like that, that would be pretty helpful because would probably make them better. Again, they've still been playing great, and that's because their main guys are playing, which is, those are the most important players. But it is something to think about because, part of having, part of the cool thing about the trade they made was that it just gave them more talent and it just allowed you to just play, better players next to Luka and Kyrie, like we talked about, as opposed to some of the other guys, like, but they're just not in the same tier of rotational guys. Like, again, Dwight Powell has been their starting centers or backup centers for a long time, but if he's your starting center, that's a below average starting center. And it's not that like Gafford is a top 10 center, but he's better than Dwight Powell, and then Lively is better than Dwight Powell. And that pushes the other guys just down into the rotation where it's like we only have to play them spot minutes if somebody's in foul trouble, or whatever. Like in the case of like if there's a certain matchup. So it's just something to keep in mind because there are some teams where I think you need both of those guys healthy.
Yeah, and it's kind of interesting, like with the Warriors game, because I think that was one of the games that they had played recently. Them putting out like Maxi Kleber and PJ Washington at the 5 was kind of interesting, and I feel like the Warriors are one of those one of the only teams that you can do that against because they play small ball as well. So, that's intriguing that you do have the depth, huh?
Yeah, but it didn't really work though because
Yeah.
they were able to still get downs and trade cities around.
Yeah, and it's interesting because I think Dallas does have some issues in terms of, I guess, the center position. Daniel Gafford, he's been starting. Lively, I think, was a backup. Up until the injury, and then Dwight Powell, I guess, got back into the rotation, but like you said, very below average in terms of what kind of impact he does bring at this point. But it's tough. I think they do need to win out to be safe. Because I think
Yes.
Phoenix is hot on their tail as well. I think they're in the same boat as
Yeah.
the Clippers at this point, but I think there's a little bit more sense of urgency and hunger from Dallas. I think I feel a little bit better about Dallas than I do about the Clippers right now, just due to the fact that obviously they have both their guys at a very healthy level, in Kyrie and Luka, whereas the Clippers, they don't have Kawhi at the moment. So, but Phoenix is right behind them. So, there is a need to win. And I think what they're saying that Lively could miss the remainder of the regular season, that's going to hurt them, I think, because your center
Yeah.
room isn't that great. Like you said, it's great when both those guys are healthy in terms of Daniel Gafford and Derek Lively, but past those two guys, you're going to be playing,
Yeah.
power forwards that are very
Right.
undersized or Dwight Powell, and that's just not a recipe for success.
Yeah, and you could see it in that Warriors game where they were giving up a lot of offensive rebounds,
Yep.
no real rim protection.
Yep.
Other than Gafford, right? Like they really couldn't afford to take him off the floor, but you can't play 48 minutes in a game. So, against a team like that, that could be a little problematic, and again, their final schedule, right? They play Golden State again, which they kind of need to win that game, I think, ideally.
100%.
Not that Golden State
That's tomorrow.
has them, it's just yeah, that's tomorrow. Or I guess if you're watching this,
Yeah.
it would be today.
Yeah.
On April 5th.
Mm-hmm.
Then they play Houston. Then they play Charlotte. Then they play Miami, Detroit, and they finish against OKC. So, again, not they had one of the easier schedules, and now it's kind of gone to a more tough schedule to close it out. Obviously outside of Charlotte and Detroit are not really anybody, but still Golden State, Houston, OKC, Miami, those are all legitimate teams. And if you lose, two of those, then like you said, that gives the other teams the opportunity to catch up. I think they do have the tiebreaker, if I'm not mistaken, against the Suns. So if they finish with the same record, then they'll be above the Suns. But again, right now it's only half a game. Although I think they won against the Hawks, so I think now it's a full game.
Okay.
Yeah, so yeah, they're 46-30. Phoenix is 45-31, so they're a full game ahead of Phoenix.
W.
Yeah. So then, again, moving around the league, Malik Monk and Kevin Herter, right? Obviously we hadn't talked about them, and this happened a little while ago, right? But their seasons are pretty much done. Kevin Herter, according to Woj, right, he had surgery to repair a torn labrum in his shoulder, and his season's done. Malik Monk, he has a sprained MCL in his knee, so he's going to be out. I think they said 4 to 6 weeks, which pretty much means unless they make a deep run, he's not coming back.
Yeah.
I mean, again, you're talking about like a month and a half, potentially. And the playoffs begin basically in 2 weeks. So, I mean, so that means when the playoffs start, he'd still be 2 weeks away from potentially being 2 weeks away. So, that's the difficulty there. And I think with Keon Ellis in the lineup, I think you could probably be okay without Herter just because he's shooting relatively well and he's a much better defender. But then you combine that with Malik Monk, that makes it more difficult because that just hurts your your bench scoring and your offense in general, right? Because he's other than Fox and Sabonis, right? That guy's basically their third best offensive player. And he comes off the bench, still plays a lot of minutes, closes a lot of games for them. He was averaging 15 points, 5 assists for them, so he does a lot of, the playmaking stuff as well, right? Pick and roll combined with, handoffs and whatnot. So that's a big loss. Obviously, they still have other guys, but, again, there comes a certain point where once you start missing like 2-3 rotational guys, and those are basically two guys that are like starters, right? Because, Malik Monk doesn't, start, but he basically plays starting minutes. And then, Kevin
100%.
Herter is like a token starter. So that's tough, and again, they're already not like a great defensive team. I think with Keon Ellis in there, I think they've been a little better. But you still have some issues there where you're still not going to be a great defensive team. And then obviously, if you want to make a playoff run, you would like to have Malik Monk, right? Because he's a guy where late in games or just in second units, he can kind of carry your offense. And now you don't have that. That probably means that's going to have to push Fox and Sabonis into playing more minutes. They're going to have to play with the second units a lot more. And that's probably going to be a little bit more taxing for them. You look at their close to the regular season, They play Boston after they just lost to the Knicks, so that's not great. Then they play the Nets, probably be fine. Then they play OKC, depending on if those guys play. Although they've actually done pretty well against OKC. They've played New Orleans, and they have not done very well against New Orleans. Then they play Phoenix. They haven't done well against them either, and they play against the Blazers. So, again, like all those other teams, they need to win out because if they don't, then they're going to fall. And the issue is that we kind of already, if you haven't already noticed in some of these schedules, some of these teams play one another.
Yeah.
Right? Like New Orleans plays Phoenix, Sacramento plays Phoenix, Sacramento plays New Orleans, and vice versa. So we already mentioned all those. So it's like, and only one of them can win, right? Like, between the Kings and the Suns, one of those teams is going to win, the other is going to lose. So whoever loses is going to be put in, no pun intended, a losing position. So,
yeah,
I mean, that's kind of the tough part. And, this is the one part of the season where you can't really afford, to have injuries at this point. And, the Kings have been one of the healthiest teams the last couple of seasons, but, unfortunately, right, injuries can sometimes just come out of nowhere, and it's a bad time to have it because it's right before the playoffs when you're trying to make a run, and it becomes a lot harder, for them now, especially when, again, those guys have basically been ruled out, for the rest of the season. Again, Monk could potentially come back if they make a deep run, but what's the likelihood that they do it? I mean, they're in the play-in right now, and there's a chance that they could lose in the play-in. And, even if they get into the playoffs, depending on who they play, they still may not be able to get out of the first round. So that's kind of a huge blow to them. At least, I guess the positive is that it's not Fox or Sabonis. So it's like you still have your two best players. You still have, your other guys, but it doesn't help. It's still not good.
Yeah, and, with Herter and Monk out, now you're going to have to rely on Keon Ellis, like you were saying, and a guy like Davion Mitchell. And I will say, Davion Mitchell has looked better in his past, 5 games where he's shooting, lights out, almost, 63% from the three-point line. And over 10 points, because on the season he's been averaging 5. So, given the opportunity, I think he can be valuable to the team. It's just a matter of, I think, without Malik Monk and Kevin Herter, although Kevin Herter's kind of had a up and down season, but, without both those guys, I think you're going to be putting a lot of strain, I think, on your depth and also on your stars, like you were saying. But, it seems like they have a lot of faith in this. They don't think the season's over. And that's kind of typical of a Mike Brown team, I guess. They're going to be trying to rely on the system and each other, which is, what they should be saying and putting out to the media. But in all seriousness and all reality, you do have to take into account the situation they're in. It's not like, they're the 3rd seed like last year. We're talking about the 8th seed Sacramento Kings. Like you said, I don't have to, divulge into the whole play-in landscape as it currently stands, but they're not the favorite in going into this play-in. If the play-in started today, they would not be the favorite. So, you do have to look at it from that perspective. But I think, it is unfortunate because this is pretty much what, a week timetable where, Kevin Herter is done for the season. Then all of a sudden Malik Monk gets hurt all in a matter of a week. So huge blows to Sacramento. And I think that might be the nail in the coffin for their season.
Right. Yeah. Because, you're basically trading offense, I guess, for defense, because that elevates Mitchell and Ellis. So it really kind of depends on what kind of offense can they give you.
Yeah.
And if they give you some offense that can help, you still don't have, the greatest rim protection, but they could give you some more peskiness on the defensive end.
Sure.
So, their offense is going to be tested, I think, to close out the season.
Yeah.
And then moving on, Kuminga, right? He's been out the last 5-ish games. Interestingly enough, they've won all of them, I think, since he's been out, including this last game, right, where they played the Rockets, and they completely smashed them, right? They won, what was it, 133 to 110, right?
Yeah.
And, pretty much about as uneventful as I expected it kind of to be. As you already know, I did not expect the Rockets to be able to, catch the Warriors in the standings. Yeah. They had already lost a few games before that, and that pretty much puts the nail in the coffin, right? Because now they are, they're 38 and 38. The Warriors are 42 and 30. They're 8 games above 500, and the Rockets are 500. So that's basically 4 games back, with 4-ish games to go. So that pretty much puts a wrap on the Rockets season, which again, still a productive season. But, from a Warrior standpoint, I think you still probably need Kaminga ideally, to come back. It's kind of been interesting how their 5-game win streak has gone because in a lot of the games, like they've kind of gone down to the wire, and in some of these games, it felt like that they were going to lose at different points, but they managed to find ways to win, which wasn't the case. A little bit, for most of the season, right? Because most of the season when they've been in crunch time, they've not been, they've been about average, like literally average. Um, Obviously this one wasn't a crunch time game. Um, but you look at their, last few games or whatever, um, right? They had the Dallas game, right? That basically, was kind of, they were up for chunks of it, then Dallas would come back and then they closed it out, right? That was a hard fought win. They had the Spurs game where they were up, almost blew the entire lead, and then closed it out. Charlotte game was uneventful. The Orlando game, right? That was the game where Draymond got suspended initially. And then, they were still able to went down to the wire, they closed it out. And then the Heat one, that was without Butler and the other guys. And, Miami couldn't do anything in the second half. So now they've won 5 in a row, 8 games above 500, looking a lot better, mainly on the defensive end. Starting lineup has changed, right? Because Trace Jackson Davis now starts at center with Kuminga out. So we'll see if they keep that. Kerr kind of hinted at that he may keep that starting five, which is interesting. But um, again, I guess with the Kuminga injury, nobody seems like it's serious. I thought he was supposed to play on Thursday because I remember him saying that he would be out on that Tuesday game against the Mavs, but back on Thursday.
Mm-hmm.
But they just had, again, I guess they just felt comfortable enough, that they could beat the Rockets without him. But
Yeah.
they're winning games. So how do you feel about this team now, compared to what it looked like, before they went on that winning streak? Because it kind of looked like the season might be done, and now the season is still alive, right? Again, because in the standings they're still close, right? Again, they're 2 games behind LA with a game coming up against them soon that could determine, who finishes, 9 and 10 or whatever, assuming it stays that.
Yeah, and it's like, I do have to bite the bullet 100% on the take about the Rockets. I guess I was just living in the hype, but yeah, for sure. The Warriors are definitely playing, I think a little bit better and up to their standards, in regards to that. And I think everybody's kind of been better as of late. I think, Clay has been quietly, I guess, better. You kind of look at him and, you feel a little bit better about the way that he's been playing recently. Obviously, Steph is being consistent. Draymond seems to be keeping a level head somewhat. And then also, playing without Kuminga is kind of a tall task, I think, because Kuminga is pretty much averaging 17 points. So, he does bring a lot to the team. But yeah, I think it's definitely a better fit. Bringing in some guys that, may not normally get a whole lot of minutes. But I do think that the Warriors kind of have a glimpse of hope. And I think they're really banking on, their playoff expertise and, the wisdom and all of the experience they do really have on this roster to kind of get out of the play-in and potentially make a huge playoff push. I don't know, how far they would go post play-in, but I think, they are definitely one of those teams that's going to be, a favorite to get out of the play-in as of right now, just based on their play. You have to feel really good about them. They've stepped up with their backs against the wall. It's kind of a similar situation with the Lakers where, the Warriors, they're what, like 7-3 in their last 10, 6-game win streak. So, like you said, they've been balling, and you have to give credit where credit is due. So, I think they're in a good spot.
Yeah, and that's gonna be the interesting thing because you mentioned post playing. The issue still is that they're still in that 10 spot, and if they stay in the 10 spot, right, you got to win both playing games. And that's the difficulty right there. And again, if the Lakers stay in the 9 spot as well, that's who they're going to have to beat if they want to get out of there. They are 2-1. In the season series, obviously, it's kind of hard to really gauge because I think, you know, in one of those games, right, LeBron was out. In another game, I think AD played like 10 minutes. So it's kind of really hard to gauge what it really looks like. I think most people probably, I mean, maybe I'm wrong. I feel like I don't know what most people think. Maybe they're 50-50. But I think, like with the Lakers, because of their size, you probably would favor them in a matchup
Yeah.
against Golden State because of the AD factor. Um,
And
combined
defense,
with
I think.
combined with LeBron. And the interesting thing with the Lakers, because is that it's really been their offense that's kind of sparked, this
Yeah.
big run. It hasn't really been the defensive. And I know on this road trip, I guess, their injury update, it's not really any significant updates, right? Obviously, Vincent came back, which I guess, is significant because that's their mid-level exception signing that hasn't really played at all. I believe Vanderbilt's supposed to be reevaluated next week, so we'll see what happens with that. And again, for them, like you mentioned, right, they're 8-2 in their last 10. They won 3 in a row. They went 5-1 on that road trip. Including a couple of games, right, where, well, maybe not a couple, but like the Bucks game I think was kind of the one that I think was you kind of penciled in as a loss, and then they ended up pulling it out. Um, and they've been great at home, 27-12. The roads where they struggled, but they were 5-1 on the road, on this road trip. And they actually, record-wise, have been, really good against teams above 500. And again, I think if you're kind of putting some stock into them, maybe you're hoping that like if those two guys can be somewhat playable, like just somewhat okay,
Hmm.
then that could probably help. Like you would think Vanderbilt could help on the defensive end. And then Vincent, just because he's a professional guy, you would expect that he could kind of come in and do some stuff on both ends of the floor. And I think that's kind of what you'd be hoping for.
Yeah.
And you'd hope that they can come back before the regular season ends. Obviously, Vincent's already back. It's just, you're just hoping that he can get his legs under him after he's been out for so long. But yeah, that's where it kind of comes down to the wire. Because again, like, we already mentioned some of these teams play against one another. The Lakers, I think now their schedule has gone back up to like the 7th toughest remaining schedule. Because we looked at their remaining schedule, and I guess we can also mention the Warriors since we hadn't mentioned their schedule, right? The Warriors play the Mavs, the Jazz, the Lakers, the Blazers, the Pelicans, and the Jazz. So obviously a much easier schedule outside of the Lakers, the Mavs, and New Orleans. And then the Lakers, right? They play the Cavs, they play the Timberwolves, they play the Warriors, and they play Memphis, and they play New Orleans. So aside from Memphis, those are all playoff teams. Couple are at home. 3 of them are at home, where they've been great. 2 of them are on the road, where they've been not so great, although they've been better as of late. So, who do you think ultimately gets that, 9-10 spot? But again, I guess that's probably not the right question because there's still a chance that one of those teams could move out, just depending on if they win out the remaining games and the teams above
Right.
them lose. So maybe that's not the right question to ask, but I guess like which team of those two do you feel higher on? I guess is probably the better question.
I guess it would be the Lakers. And it might be like a little bit of recency bias and the fact that I saw them in person like pretty recently, but like I don't know. There's something about them where I think if their bench can just really lock in, then you can kind of see the potential and the amount of depth that they truly do have. And like you said, there are some minor injuries to guys like Vanderbilt and Christian Wood and people like that, but like I think at nauseum, like the bench is pretty good if they're playing well, and I think they are a little bit more deeper than the Warriors at this point. That might be a hot take to some people, I don't know, but in general, I think I am a little bit higher on them, and I think I could see the Lakers potentially making a push, especially if like LeBron and Anthony Davis really turn up. I know LeBron has been pretty much day to day questionable, whatever, almost every night, but now that they're kind of going back to this home stand, I think that'll help them out a lot because, like you were saying, they're very good at home, and I don't really expect them to lose a lot of games because I'm looking at their schedule. Like they've got to play Cleveland, Minnesota. That's going to be a really tough one. I think the Warriors will be a dogfight. Shouldn't lose to the Grizzlies, and I think they can most definitely beat the Pelicans. It all just comes down to, I think, being focused. And like I said, the bench guys really need to step up. And I think you could also even argue some starters. I don't know, depending on the lineup, what the lineup's going to be. I think a Rui Hachimura could definitely be an X factor for them, on this little, I guess, road to the playoffs where, you're kind of looking at him to step up on defense interior because we all know that he's not a great perimeter defender, but On the interior, he's pretty good, and he can stick with guys because of his length. But also offensively, it'd be nice to see him kind of step up. And we already know what D'Lo can do as well. But I don't know. It's interesting. I think there's more potential and upside due to the fact that I think there are some more consistent guys on their team versus Golden State.
It's when really the start of their upside, I guess, in terms of them playing better is when they changed the starting five and they put Rui in there.
Yeah.
As opposed to what was it? It was like Torian Prince. Obviously, they had stretches earlier in the year where they had what was it? It was like both D'Lo and Austin.
Yeah. Can't do that, man.
And Rui came off the bench because we talked about it, where it's like all these guys you paid money to, and they're all coming off the bench.
Mm-hmm.
It was kind of like when we talked about Golden State, where it was like they were starting Pods, they were starting, Trace Jackson Davis, and it's like
Sure.
it's just kind of hard to start, a bunch of these minimum contract, rookie contract guys over guys that are making so much money.
Yeah.
Especially if you don't have like especially if it's like mid-tier contracts, right? Like just obviously like with Golden State, they have what like 5 guys making basically max or close to max money.
Mm-hmm.
So it's like one of those, and a couple of those guys play similar positions, so it's like one of them's gonna have to come off the bench anyway.
Sure.
But in the Lakers case, it's a little bit different. So that's kind of the thing, right? Since they put him in the starting 5, they've been, I think, second offensively pretty much since the beginning of the year. Yeah, obviously the defense has not been very good.
No.
It's been better since during the road trip. And I think some of that comes down to, like you said, the effort level, focus has increased, because in some of those games at different points, it was not there. And you can see the difference, right? Because we talked about it even from like a LeBron standpoint, where it's like, he's not going to be able to do some of this type of crazy stuff like what we saw against the Nets every night. Because if he does, then that means that there's going to have to be sacrifices made on the other end of the floor.
Right.
And so, ideally that's when you would like the other guys to kind of pick it up. And it seems like everybody has kind of come along with him. And, I guess also the fact that they've kind of had a more stabilizing starting unit, right? The rotation makes a lot more sense. You're just playing your better players. And it's kind of an interesting starting 5, right? Because it's like all 5 guys can score in different ways. And it's like the worst offensive player in the starting 5 is probably Rui, but that's a good offensive player.
Yeah.
And he's been shooting the 3, because we talked about going into the season, what was his 3-point shooting going to look like? Because he shot, 50% or whatever from 3 in the playoffs. And he's been over 40% on the season.
Yeah.
Which, and that was kind of a funny thing when we talked about who was going to start earlier in the year, before the season started, because I think you kind of made the case for Rui to start.
Heck yeah.
I think, because I think I said I thought Vanderbilt should start, but I thought they would start Rui because they just paid him. And I didn't really have an issue like with, Rui starting. And then Vanderbilt got hurt. They tried out Torian Prince, and it was okay in the preseason. But as we talked about, we should not care about preseason.
Yeah. Get fooled every year.
And in the regular season, did not work, was absolutely horrible. And I think they just took too long. Because now, with that starting 5, they're I think like 22 or 23 or whatever it is, and 11, which is great.
Yeah.
But the problem is that that's only like 40-ish games in an 82-game regular season, or I guess in this case, they played 77 games. So that means that there was a stretch where you didn't use that lineup at all. And, to be fair, Rui earlier in the season, right, he had a couple of injuries, right, where I think he had the concussion, then he had the broken nose. And then they tried to start him early after the in-season tournament, and then he had a calf injury. But I think with, the Lakers, kind of like with Golden State, it's like now you've kind of found a rotation that you feel more comfortable with. And some of those guys are also playing better, right? Like you mentioned Clay for Golden State. He was very bad earlier in the season. And it's still like a little more up and down, I guess, but still more up, I guess, as of late, and then, even a guy, when you factor in, some of the other players on the roster, right? Like there were stretches where like, because Gary Payton was hurt, he couldn't really give you much, right? Like Chris Paul offensively was horrible, to begin the season, right? Where he was shooting like 30 whatever percent from the field. And now he can't miss from 3, right? His jump shooting has been way better as of late, right? And then from a Laker perspective, right? Austin Reeves was not very good to begin the season. And then, D'Lo, who's been great for most of the season, he had that 1 month in December where he was bad. So, I mean, that's kind of the thing. But, like, now most of the play from those guys has stabilized. But I think, what you mentioned about with the Lakers, maybe you feel like the higher end talent is probably better because it's like with Golden State, it's Steph, and then there's a big drop off, from him to their second best player. Um, where it's like if he's not great, it becomes a lot more difficult for them to win. Obviously, he didn't shoot very well against the Mavs and they won. He didn't shoot very well against Orlando for most of the game and they won. But at the highest level, it's the best teams. You're going to need him to be really good. And if it's not him, who can you really trust outside of him? Because I still feel like it's kind of hard for me to like completely trust the team. Just because they've been so up and down at different points. I know it's been a lot better as of late. It's just, from a Laker perspective, at least you can say we have two top tier guys, right? AD's basically been their best player, and then after that it's LeBron. And it's not like it's a wide gap between the two, right? Though they're both very good players. And then even after that, if you can get like a couple, three of those guys to play well for the most part, right? Like Reeves, since the beginning of since January has been pretty consistent. D'Lo's been pretty consistent for the most part since January, right? Same with Rui. So it feels like there's been a little more, at least offensive consistency. Um, but we don't know because again, you you lose one of those two games before you play the Warriors, and then you lose the Warriors game and they have the tiebreaker, and then you're 10 and they're 9, right? That could kind of cripple your season essentially. Or if you continue to win out, which like you said is possible because it's not like they haven't beaten any of these teams. They've beaten all of these teams before. Then you may somehow be able to clutch it out. One of those teams above you falls, and you're in 8. And I think for both of those teams, ideally you want to be in at least no worse than 8 because I feel like if you're stuck in the 9 and 10 spot by the end of the regular season, it's going to be really hard to justify a deep run because that means that you're going to have to win 2 playing games, as we've already mentioned, and then you're the 8 seed, and who knows who the 1 seed is? If it's the Nuggets, you're not beating them unless they're hurt. I know some people have made the case that like, oh, maybe it might be better to play them in the first round as opposed to later because I think you get more days off. But if I'm those two teams, I would rather just not want to play them at all. Let somebody else beat them. Uh, yeah, like and I'm not saying that they're going to avoid them. You know what I mean? It's just from the perspective of like, you'd rather play someone else and then maybe they get knocked out by somebody else, or I guess worst case scenario, you meet them in like the conference finals or something. I don't think you want to really play them in the first round because I don't think you're going to be able to get out because we know both of those teams have some very severe matchup problems, against them just because and which is funny because they're both two very different teams, the Lakers and Golden State, but they have similar issues where it's like you know with the Lakers' advantage against Golden State, they have size, but they don't really have a size advantage against the Nuggets. Um, that kind of goes away because the Nuggets have, one of the biggest teams in the league. And then, from a Warrior perspective against the Nuggets, obviously I know some people kind of have the idea of like, oh, they could be a tougher matchup for the Nuggets because of the step factor. You
Right.
have like a guy who can kind of go nuclear. But the Nuggets kind of have guys defensively where they have enough length where they can kind of slow him down to a degree. I think. And then obviously Golden State doesn't really have anybody that can really slow down, Jokic, obviously. And even like Aaron Gordon has been a tough matchup problem for Golden State because he's bigger than basically everybody, on that team. And he's, in some of the games, if you've seen them, obviously I know you have, but like, in some of the games that they played in the regular season this year, Gordon was a huge factor against the Warriors because of the fact that he could get offensive rebounds. He could get to the line. Like I think in that one game where they were down like 20 in the fourth or whatever, and then they came back and Jokic hit the crazy game winner. Um, Gordon was getting offensive rebounds. He's getting to the free throw line, getting dump offs, and it's just the problem, right? Like I think Gordon against the Lakers, he hasn't gone off to the same degree. He
Right.
can still be a problem because of what he can do defensively, I think, against a guy like LeBron, because he is big, he is athletic, he's physical. But offensively, they've kind of just like every other team, right? They kind of back off of him and force him to hit jump shots. And they have a little bit more size to where it's like, LeBron is still a big guy, AD is still a big guy, but it can still be problematic. But that's the issue. Is that like you don't want to play that team at all. I
No.
think your hope if you're stuck in 9-10, I think you have to hope that the Nuggets don't get the 1 seed.
Yep.
Otherwise, you got to get out of the play-in. so that way, you have a chance to kind of beat either 7 or 8. And it's not like any of the teams in the plan are going to throw a play-in game where it's like, oh, the Nuggets are the 1 seed, so that means the Nuggets are the 2 seed, so that means that we need to lose this play-in game in a
Right.
7-8 matchup. And like, no, you don't want to do that.
Right.
Um,
That's a bad move.
Right. And like to be fair, it's not just the Lakers and Warriors that I think would have a tough time against the Nuggets. I mean, I think most of the lower seeds, because they're just not as good,
I
would
think
be a
most of
tough
the
match.
West.
Right. They're considered the favorites in the West for a reason.
Mhm.
To be fair, like the Suns have played them good in these games because of the offense, but I just don't necessarily know. Like, again, you got to beat them 4 out of 7 times. So like that's kind of the difficulty. Is
How
like you either
sustainable
have
is it?
Right. So it's like you either have to outscore them or you have to out execute them. We've talked about that. And that's the tough problem with the Nuggets is that you got to be a team that can do one or the other. I think it's kind of difficult to out execute them just because of the talent and the skill level and the IQ of their stars. So you kind of have to outscore them because they don't usually just blow teams out of the water. Usually it's like, it's kind of a back and forth and then they pull away at the end. I mean, they have been able to blow out teams, but, their point differential is a little bit lower than, say, a team like Boston. But, where they kill you is late in the games. So that's where you're just going to have to outscore them and just kind of just hope, hey, we just knock down a bunch of threes and just kind of blow them out. But again, are you going to be able to, again, as we mentioned, can you do that 4 times? I don't think any of those teams can necessarily do that. Um, but to be fair, you never know because but it is kind of funny just the fact that the main teams that we kind of looked at as having the best chance to upset the Nuggets are all lower seeds, whereas the teams that I don't maybe overlooked is probably the right word to use, right? Or like OKC, I think we thought they'd be better, but I don't think we thought they'd be a top 3 seed in the
Heck
West.
no. Nope.
Same with Minnesota. Um, and they're the higher seed. So like math wise, they would have the best chance. But that again, health is important, and that's why winning a title is hard because you got to be healthy, and you got to get healthy at the right time. Because again, for the Kings, we already mentioned it's bad luck that you had two, relatively important players. They're down for the count
Yeah.
right at the end. For the Knicks, kind of a similar thing, right? Obviously, I guess Anunoby can be back, but you need him and Randall, and Randall's out for the count. He's not coming back. But say for Philly, you got a boost because you got Embiid back at the right time, and now you have a chance to close out the season on a win streak. And maybe you can somehow like just luck up and kind of get out of the play because again we talked about it with Miami. They lost the game right at the end of Philly, which again that's kind of been a problem for them closing out games. And they were 6, and they would have stayed in 6 if they had beaten Philly. Now they're in 7 with the Sixers, and then that means you're in a play-in game against Philly with a healthy Embiid, and that's not a spot you want to be in. So for all these teams, that's kind of why we went over the injury stuff because it's all really important.
Yeah, it all factors into the standings and what playoff matchups are going to potentially look like due to the fact that some guys are going to be out and some guys are back, and that makes a huge difference, like you were saying.
Because and like sometimes it's kind of wild stuff. Because say with the Rockets, right? We kind of thought their season was completely done when Şengün went down. Then they went on a crazy win streak. And now lo and behold, they've gone on a losing streak again, and that ends their season.
Yeah.
But again, they already were without multiple guys, so that kind of makes it tough, anyways. Which again makes their winning streak, even more, I think, impressive. Even though I know a lot of people mentioned that it was against a lot of crappy teams. Because I mean, again, no matter how much you slice it, 11-game win streak is still impressive, especially when you're shorthanded. It's just
Absolutely.
again, I would not have done what Tari Eason did. I just think that was a mistake.
Yeah,
And
that was
maybe it
dumb.
happens anyways. And maybe it happens anyways where they just get smashed because the Warriors take it seriously. But that's why you can't give a team like that ammo. You just can't.
No.
It's
Yeah.
like, but that's kind of what happens when it's like, you're a young team that hasn't, now you just won 11 games. So now you kind of, this is your first taste of what it's like to win, but you haven't truly won yet. And, that's where, again, where you mentioned like a team like Golden State, the experience comes in, where it's like,
Yeah.
this was kind of a highly anticipated game, and it ended up being a complete dud because from start to finish, Golden State just took it to them.
Yeah, and I think the guys on the Warriors handled it well. They didn't really feed into it. They didn't get drawn in, and
Yeah,
they didn't fall for the bait.
Right, yeah. Draymond literally said, "We don't care about the Rockets."
Yeah.
Like he just, yeah, before and this was before they played them like a week ago. He was
Mhm.
like, "We don't care about that team."
Yeah.
So, um, Now, news rumors. Steve Clifford, right? He's gonna step down at the end of the season. I guess I don't know why they couldn't have just said fired, but I guess it just sounds more respectable.
Yeah.
Um, but either way, the hiring was always strange to me because I know that like he coached them before, he was okay. And then they fired him, then brought in Borrego. Seemed like they were getting better, and then they fired him, and then they brought Clifford back, which didn't really make any sense to me. Um, and now they fired him again. After what, like one season?
Yep.
So kind of a weird thing. They mentioned, some names of coaches. I mean, to be fair, I don't know much about them, so it's not like I can really give any like fair input, on who they should pick. I know they mentioned names like David Adelman, right? Rick Adelman's son, in Denver, Jordy Fernandez in Sacramento, Charles Lee in Boston, Kevin Young in Phoenix. I think I saw somebody mention that they think that Lee may be the favorite because he has some personal relationships in there. Again, like I said, I don't know who they should ideally choose. I've heard the names before as like solid assistant coaches. Um, but I think, again, for Charlotte, you got to choose somebody who I think can kind of come in and establish some level of professionalism. And I know Clifford tried to do that. It's just, again, he was a retread. So it's like, you might as well bring in somebody new, see if you can kind of have somebody in that maybe just be able to connect to the players a little bit more, and kind of establish something because we've already talked about in Charlotte, like where they desperately needed a culture reset. Seems like they're on their way to doing that. So if they can get a coach in there, I think that, and hopefully it's one of those names and hopefully they're good. I think that's where that could help them because it seemed like they were on an upwards trajectory a few years ago when they brought in Borrego. Because I still remember like when LaMelo was first there, he was coming off the bench. He wasn't even starting as the number 2 pick, or
Yeah.
excuse me, number 3 pick,
Yeah.
which doesn't normally happen. Like you're usually like a lock to start,
Yeah.
when you're a top 3 pick. But there were concerns, I guess, about his maturity or whatever. And he handled it well, and then eventually he earned the starting spot, and then he got better. But now it's like you still have to establish some stuff in that Charlotte locker room. Um, so we'll see what they can do because
Yeah.
we don't know who they're going to hire, but I think it was time to probably let Steve Clifford go because he had already been there, didn't really do much. I guess he was there when the Hornets had like one of their better mediocre-ish seasons, but it's like
Was that the
what?
play-in year or whatever?
No, I think it was like one of the playoff years where it was
Okay.
like maybe Al Jefferson or
Oh, okay.
Kemba
You're
Walker.
talking about like way back then. Okay.
Yeah, I think that's when he was there, if I'm
Okay.
not mistaken.
Got you. Yeah, I mean it's weird. Like you said, I've always kind of been puzzled by it. You just got to bring in new blood at this point. He still kind of has the, I guess, stink of the old regime, if that kind of makes sense. Where it's just not a good fit. They need to reevaluate and and overhaul the culture. I think with the Hornets, this has been a team that we've been saying has lacked in maturity, lacked in seriousness. Taking a step back, I think, from where they were a few seasons ago, where you actually felt like they were on the up and up in the East where they should be. But, lo and behold, it's where we are. And like you said, hopefully one of the guys on the list does get the job. I would be intrigued to see who really wants to take it because I think it is a tough task considering, what you do have. But at the end of the day, they do have a lot of assets and I think their future is bright, but it does really start with the coach.
Yeah, I mean, yeah, and I just checked. He coached them from 2013 to 2018, so that's what I
Okay.
thought. So yeah, I mean, again, he also coached the Magic, so I mean, again, it has nothing to do with him. Although, I mean, I guess it kind of does. Not him personally, but you know what I mean. It's
Mm-hmm.
just like from the perspective of it's time to get somebody else in there.
100%.
Um, and I think he's tried to kind of do some stuff because I know he's talked about, at different points, like, yeah, we're just not that good, amongst other stuff.
Right.
And again, when your best player is out for most of the season and other guys are in and out, it's kind of tough anyways. But um, it's pretty clear because we talked about it from the moment that they changed ownership that changes were coming. And they've been coming, right? Like they already changed the coach, or excuse me, they already changed the front office, right? Obviously they're going to change the coach. We know they made trades at the trade deadline, so they even changed the roster, right? So some of the previous regime guys are now gone.
Yep.
So, hopefully that means things are going to be on the up and up for the Hornets. But we'll just have to wait and see, I guess.
Mm-hmm.
Um, and then, moving on, right? Rajon Rondo, right? Retires. So obviously You know,
Sir.
he mentioned this on the All the Smoke podcast, right? You know, obviously he had already been, you know, out of the league for, you know, a couple seasons, right? You know, his last season, was 2 seasons ago, right? You know, he was on the Lakers and then he was on the Cavs, you know, in the 21-22 season. Um, you know, finishes what, 10 points a game, 8 assists, 4.5 rebounds. You know, two-time champion, right? Won a title in Boston, as the starting point guard, won a title with the Lakers, right, as the backup point guard. Um, you know, so again, you know, obviously he had the ACL injury, right? Kind of like in the middle of his, you know, peak years, kind of, right? I think he had it in the 2012, 2013 season,
Yeah.
right? So that was kind of the last year that the big three Celtics were together, and he was having a really good season. And then he tore his ACL and just wasn't really the same after that. You know, had a couple of years for some teams, right, where he was productive, right? Like, you know, he had the years in New Orleans, right? Obviously the Laker years. Um, and then I guess, you know, the one Sacramento year that was kind of strange. But you know, I feel like it's kind of funny where I think if you like simulated his career again, there could be like an even better version. And but this version was already really good. You know,
Yeah, for
obviously, you
sure.
know, you factor in playoff Rondo, right? You know, that was a thing, where he had some crazy playoff performances. Um, you know, in some of those years, right? I mean, like, you know, you know, again, you know, I think, you know, that Bulls one was kind of wild, right? Because, you know, I think, you know, that Bulls team was kind of just in a weird spot going nowhere. They were the eighth seed against the Celtics. They won the first 2 games. Then he got hurt, and then they lost the next four. You know, maybe if he's healthy, maybe they win it out. Um, so, you know, obviously he reinvented himself as a backup point guard. But do you think he's a Hall of Famer?
Yeah, I would say so. Due to the fact that, like you said, some of the playoff games that he's had and some of just like the stat lines that he's had in general have been very wild, where, you know, he's putting up 20, 20, and 10 or something like that. And then also the fact that he did win a championship, you know, the career numbers, I think, are probably where somebody would make a case like that he shouldn't be. But I think, you know, his impact on the basketball game is out of this world. I think his IQ is, you know, far and large above, you know, average. I think, you know, he's one of the smartest NBA players to ever play the game, and I think it would be intriguing to see him potentially get into coaching. I know it might be hard considering, you know, politics and the way that the league works, but I think his basketball mind would for sure, you know, be of use, I think, you know, in the NBA. And I think even like LeBron talked about that on his podcast where he was talking about, you know, Rondo and why he isn't a coach or whatnot. So, but I think, you know, he is a Hall of Famer. I think, you know, you can't really discredit that two-time NBA champion. I think that's enough.
Think so. Yeah, I think so too. I
Yeah.
think it's like you said, maybe where some people maybe where they don't make him like a first ballot Hall of Famer, maybe just like you said, the career numbers just and you know the numbers were affected by you know the latter part of his career. He
Yeah.
wasn't playing as significant of a role at times because you know he had the injury.
Mm-hmm.
But I think, like you said, I think because of the impact and again he was on winning teams. Um, and all that, like he should be in the Hall of Fame. So you know, we'll see what happens. But yeah, congrats because again, that's a successful career. That's a great career, right? You won 2 titles, and you were a key factor for both of them. Um, I mean, you know, that's awesome.
But yeah, for sure. Shout out to him.
Yeah, and then you know, speaking of two guys that just, or I guess three people that got entered into the Hall of Fame. So we got Chauncey Billups, Vince Carter, Jerry West was put in, I think, for the third time, this time as an executive, because he was already in there as a player.
Mm-hmm.
So, you know, obviously those are kind of, you know, throwbackish names. Obviously, you know, Vince Carter, you know, to be fair, didn't even retire that long ago. Um, right? He played 3 seasons or whatever. I guess, yeah, an NBA record, you know, which is nuts. You know, he played from, you know, 1998 to 2020,
That's
right? And I
crazy,
think I
bro.
remember I think I remember this was like right before COVID. I think it was the spring break, so this was like early March or whatever, mid March or whatever of 2020. And I remember we saw. I went to see with my dad the Hawks play the Wizards, and I remember like he played in that game, and that you know kind of ended up being one of his final games,
Yeah,
which was kind of nuts. And he was getting standing O's and whatnot. I mean, he wasn't retired after that game, but you know what I mean.
for sure.
Um, but yeah, you know, he kind of you know was if he had played like in today's NBA, he'd be you know on you know, he'd be a highlight, you know, internet, TikTok or
Oh
whatever
yeah,
sensation. I mean, he already was, you know, for that generation, you know, in terms of, you know, Sports Center and whatnot, just because every night he'd do something crazy. I mean, that's why the nickname was half man, half amazing.
Yeah.
But again, the longevity and the fact that he was still like, a relatively productive player, even around like the age of 40. I think I remember he was on one of those Memphis team, a couple of those Memphis teams that went to the playoffs. Um, but yeah, so great career for him. Obviously didn't win a title, but still had great numbers, right? 17, 4 and 3. And that's with like the latter half of his career, right, being like a role guy, right? If you look at the
Yeah.
earlier half of his career, right, he was like, 25,
Yeah. He was legit, bro.
yeah, he was a legit, offensive guy,
Yeah.
that could defend, he could block shots and get steals and whatnot. But either way, yeah, he was a crazy player in a good way. And then Billups, right? You're talking about him. That's a guy where he was a Finals MVP.
Big
Um,
shot.
yeah, yeah, big Mr. Big,
Yeah,
yeah,
man.
yeah. So 15-4. Um, he was on the Detroit Pistons team, right, that won the title with Ben Wallace, Rasheed Wallace, Tayshaun Prince, Rip
Yeah.
Hamilton, Finals MVP. Went to back-to-back finals. They lost, to the Spurs. I think in 7, right? That was like the crazy one where like I think it was Robert Horry who hit like a go-ahead shot. I think in game 5 or 6 where they would have closed it out against the Spurs. I think it was game 6 where they would have closed it out and won, and then they lost the game.
Mhm.
But either way, right? He had kind of an interesting career where, unlike Vince Carter, I don't think his career's kind of started out as a guy where you would have expected him to get into the Hall of Fame. I
No.
think he was drafted by Boston, if I'm not mistaken, and then was traded midway through that season to Toronto, then ended up in Denver, Minnesota, Detroit. And then all of a sudden just got better every year. And then, before you know it, now he's in the Hall of Fame. So obviously we don't have to debate whether or not those guys are Hall of Famers because they're in the Hall of Fame.
Yeah.
So
Well deserved, I think, for sure.
I think, yeah, and we both definitely feel like they should have been in there anyways, and now they're in there. So, congratulations to them. And then Jerry West, he's in there as an executive. We obviously know what he did, right? He put together some of those Shaq and Kobe Laker championship teams. I think he helped put together I think he was there with Durant going to the Warriors, if I'm not mistaken.
Yeah.
Uh, so he did a lot. So he put a lot of really good teams together. I think he also was kind of the guy for Golden State that was like, don't trade Clay for Kevin Love. You got to keep him.
Hmm.
So, he helped put together some great teams as well. So, obviously well deserved for all three of them.
Yeah. Very pivotal. All three of these guys.
Yeah. Yeah, so that pretty much concludes today's episode of Off Ball Take. Again, let us know your thoughts in the comments, about the injuries, and the returns of different guys and, how you think it'll impact, the seedings, the playoffs, depending on which guys come back and which guys aren't back. And again, also let us know your thoughts on, the retirements, Hall of Fame stuff, what you think of those guys as well. Maybe you have a favorite moment that you want to share in the comments. Leave it in the comments. We'll read it. Again, we didn't read one in the beginning, so that means we didn't get a comment. But also remember to like and subscribe, and we'll see you Monday.